Genesis chapter 5. As we all know, today is Father's Day, a day set aside to honor, show appreciation, love to our fathers. Though Mother's Day became an official American holiday in 1914, Father's Day has had a far more difficult road. Just a brief history: on December 6th, 1907, in Monongah, West Virginia, 361 men were killed. 250 of them were fathers, in the worst mining disaster in American history. Anna Jarvis, that same year, successfully began her promotion of Mother's Day. So Grace Golden Clayton suggested to her pastor that they honor fathers, the fathers who were killed in the mine, and a service was held July 5th, 1908 in Fairmont, West Virginia. But that event didn't have the same repercussions as the Mother's Day events. On June 19th, 1910, a Father's Day celebration was held at the YMCA in Spokane, Washington. And in 1911, James Adams proposed that a citywide Father's Day celebration be held in Chicago, but she was shut down or turned down. In 1912, there was a Father's Day celebration in Vancouver, Washington. In 1913, national recognition of the day was introduced to Congress, but it was turned down. Calvin Coolidge in 1924 recommended that the day be observed throughout the nation, but he stopped short of issuing a national proclamation because of all the attempts earlier had been defeated. In 1957, a senator from Maine wrote a Father's Day proposal accusing Congress of ignoring fathers while honoring mothers. 1966, so President Johnson issued the first presidential proclamation honoring fathers, designating the third Sunday in June as Father's Day. 6 years later, 1972, the day was made a permanent holiday when President Nixon signed it into law. So it's had a much more difficult road than Mother's Day. We do feel led of the Lord to bring a message that somewhat coincides with Father's Day. As we said on Mother's Day, God created male and female. You realize the term mothers and fathers offends people today? God created male and female. Genesis 1:27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Then he repeats it in Genesis 5:2. God knows everything. God knew what would be happening in our time. So God put in his word, male and female created he them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. And that's not hate speech. That's fact. God created male and female. And this is a part and a very important part of His design for the family unit. He brought Adam and Eve together in marriage. By so doing, created the family. He created the family. By God's design, both fathers and mothers bring ingredients into home that are absolutely crucial to the well-being of the home. And they are vital forces in shaping the lives of children. He created them to fulfill a divine task. Male and female, He gave each one a divine task in the family unit. You go away from that, you have dysfunction. You go away from that, you have unlimited problems. Just stay with God's design. Paul spoke of God's design in order for the family in Ephesians 5 and 6. He mentioned husbands, wives, fathers, children. And we see that fathers are more than a biological necessity. They hold a very special place and they have a vital role in bringing strength and stability into society, into our homes and churches. They have a divine role. Fathers have a divine role. They are to work to support their family. That's their responsibility. They are to be a good example in life. They are an authority figure, the head of their homes, reflecting Christ's headship. Not just the head of the home, the boss. They are the head reflecting Christ's headship, thus providing nourishment, nourishing, cherishing, and loving leadership for the family. Leading their family in righteousness. That's God's design. Being a teacher, an encourager in the ways of God. Setting the spiritual tone of the home. I believe that's their responsibility. Presiding over their homes in love and righteousness, they are a vital force in shaping the lives of their children. They are called to love the mother of their children as Christ loved the church. If they do not do that, they have failed. Fathers are not expendable parts of the family unit. We read in Psalm 12, verse 1, "Help, Lord, for the godly man ceaseth." And in Proverbs 20, verse 6, "A faithful man who can find." Those two statements reveal the rarity of godly and faithful men. Just like the virtuous woman, it's not the norm, but it is our calling. Wherever they are found, just like the virtuous woman, they are a treasure and they are a blessing. I want to read Genesis 5, verses 21 through 24. And Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God. And he was not, for God took him. As leader of the family unit, some husband says, well, I just leave that all to my wife. Well, it still doesn't release you of your responsibility. As leader of the family unit, it is incumbent upon the man to have a right relationship with the Lord. And we have an example of such in our text. We read in verse 21 that Enoch begat Methuselah. And in verse 22 that Enoch begat sons and daughters. So Enoch was a father. And in verses 22 and 24, we are twice told that Enoch walked with God. So he was a father who walked with God. Oh, how we need such today. We cannot overstate the need of fathers who walk with God. That's our subject. Fathers who walk with God. And though the message is for men in particular, it's for all of us in general. We all need to walk with God. Wherever we are in life, we are to walk with God. We need to be a people who walk with God. Again, Enoch was a father, and Enoch walked with God. That is a definitive statement. Enoch walked with God. That is a very meaningful statement. Enoch walked with God. That is an extraordinary statement. It's not the norm. Enoch walked with God. It is a miraculous statement. God had to do a work in his heart for that to transpire. Enoch, a man with sons and daughters, walked with God. Oh, the impact of such a life. So let's consider the setting of that statement. Enoch walked with God. Enoch was a man. He wasn't an angelic being. He was a man. He was a man of flesh and blood. Being such, he was not perfect. He had sin. He had infirmities. He had limitations. He had a sinful nature, which means that he had natural inclinations towards sin and the way from God. Being a man, he had temptations. He had spiritual battles. He had spiritual struggles. There were obstacles in his life to be overcome. Do not forget that Enoch was flesh and blood. But Enoch walked with God. In spite of all those things, Enoch walked with God. Being a man of flesh and blood, he had temporal matters to attend to. We know from the genealogy that Enoch was a son, and he had siblings. We read that in verse 19. And Jared lived after he begat Enoch. So Jared was his father. 800 years and begat sons and daughters. So Enoch had brothers and sisters. Enoch begat Methuselah. Enoch begat sons and daughters. Enoch had a wife. Enoch had sons and daughters. We read in verse 25 that his son Methuselah begat Lamech. So Enoch had grandchildren. So Enoch was a son. He was a brother. He was a husband. He was a father. He was a grandfather. And all of this involves responsibility. All of this has burdens and concerns and trials. And Enoch walked with God. Enoch walked with God. We're not told, but I'm sure that Enoch had had a secular calling as well, which is another set of responsibilities, another set of concerns and trials. But Enoch walked with God. In other words, Enoch's life was not defined by being a son or a sibling or a husband or a father or a grandfather or by his secular calling. But all of these things were defined by this: Enoch walked with God. That is the defining statement. It's not that Enoch was a husband or a father or a grandfather or had a secular job. That is not what defines Enoch. The definitive statement is Enoch walked with God. That defined everything else. Everything else is brought under this umbrella. Enoch walked with God. We must never forget that. Thirdly, he lived in sinful and extremely trying times. So he was a man. He had temporal matters to attend to, family matters, secular matters. And he lived in its sinful and extremely trying times. Enoch lived in pre-flood times, when the emphasis of life was not upon the worship of God. I'm not saying there was no worship of God. We know there was. But that wasn't the emphasis in the overall population. Nor was walking with God the emphasis. Nor was pleasing God the emphasis. You see, in pre-flood times, which is we are pre-second coming times, in pre-flood times, everything was moving in an intensifying and increasing way toward Genesis 6, verse 5. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Everything was moving toward the judgment of God, and in an increasing manner. So it is in pre-second coming times. Everything's moving in an increasing way toward the reign of Antichrist. Now there are 622 years from Adam to Enoch, we see here in Genesis 5. And during that 622 years, the difficulties, the troubles, the problems, and the burdens due to sin were intensifying. They were prevailing more and more. And Enoch walked with God. The obstacles, the hurdles due to sin were intensifying. And Enoch walked with God. The challenges, the opposition, the discouragement due to sin, all of these were intensifying. And Enoch walked with God. The ungodliness and the corruption and the lust and the vanity and the worldly pleasure and worldly engrossment with everyday life, all of these were intensifying and becoming more and more. And Enoch walked with God. The spiritual indifference, the spiritual unresponsiveness, the spiritual trifling and rejecting of God for their own self-interest, they were intensifying and becoming more and more. And Enoch walked with God. Overall wickedness and degeneration were intensifying and becoming more and more. Yet we read, and Enoch walked with God. The emphasis of the times, pre-flood times, was becoming more and more and more upon the pleasures of life. And the growing attitude of the day was eat, drink, and be merry. Have a good time, do whatever you want. It was a day of mockers. It was a day of despisers. It was a day when people took great pleasure in committing sin. And they mocked the message and the promises of God. It was a day of when the godly were ridiculed. By the time you get to Noah, there weren't many godly left. And very few, just a handful, loved God. And those who did profess to know God were being drawn aside. The sons of God were intermarrying with the daughters of men. There was a time when God's people were being swallowed up by the ways and the philosophies and the pursuits of the world. There was a growing indifference, a growing coldness toward God and His ways. And these, again, it was an increasing wicked, degenerate, and perverted society. Yet in spite of it all, Enoch walked with God. What a testimony. What an example. So what we have before us is a man like you and I, who like you and I had human tendencies. He had human struggles. He also had earthly responsibilities. He had the burdens of life. And he lived in perilous times when satanic influence had saturated society. And all around him was the filth and vileness of sin. And even God's people were falling prey and living lives far, far below what God had for them. And Enoch walked with God. So that's an amazing statement. And Enoch walked with God. But it shows that we can. We can. So let's look at the life that Enoch lived. His life is summed up in those words. Enoch walked with God. And as we've preached in the past, these are words that break the pattern. Genesis 5 is a genealogy chapter. What that means is it is a chapter rarely read. People skip over genealogies. It is a genealogy chapter that covers 1,056 years. And like all genealogies, there is a continuity about it. There is a uniformity. There is a very definite pattern throughout the genealogy. Leading up to our text, there are 6 men or 6 generations prior to Enoch. And then following the text, there are 3 men or generations. So before and after the text, the pattern is so-and-so lived, and at a certain age, he begat his heir. And then so-and-so lived on so many years after that and had more children. Followed by so-and-so lived X amount of years and he died. That's the pattern throughout the genealogy. Somewhat monotonous, but then comes verse 22. And Enoch walked with God. That breaks the pattern. The pattern is broken by that statement. Enoch walked with God. There is a very natural ebb and flow of the genealogy, and then we come to, and Enoch walked with God. This is not a subtle break. You can't help but notice this break in the pattern. You can't read this genealogy and say, oh, I didn't notice that. It is a definite break in the pattern. So it ought to get our attention. And Enoch walked with God. And I believe that's why God put it there, to get our attention. There's a break in the pattern. Again, not a subtle break. A very marked and distinctive break. Enoch walked with God. Now, Enoch was a man who lived beyond and above the pattern that was all around him. You look around at life today. You can go in any part of history, any generation, there's a pattern. There's a pattern that people tend to follow. The pattern may change from generation to generation, but there's a pattern. And when anyone walks with God, that's a break in the pattern. That ought to be us. We ought not be defined by our times. Our life ought to be defined by, and he, she walked with God. He was the exception to the norm. Who in the world would want to be normal today? Enoch walked with God. I want to tell you something. If you're normal, you're a sick individual. That may offend you. If you're normal, you've lost your mind. You're absolutely insane. I don't want to be normal. Enoch walked with God. He was not confined. He was not bound or defined by the pattern of the world. How many people are bound in the pattern? Bound to the pattern. Enoch walked with God. That's a memorable life. That's a unique life. That's an extraordinary life. The pattern of his life was not the norm of the day. Enoch walked with God. Enoch, a husband, a father, a grandfather, walked with God. A drastic and marked difference. Enoch walked with God. Enoch, a husband, a father, a grandfather, rose and lived above the ordinary to the extraordinary. Enoch, a husband, a father, a grandfather, rose and lived above the plane of normal. He rose above it. And Enoch walked with God. Here is a man who had a truly remarkable life. Enoch walked with God. I read obituaries. I enjoy reading obituaries. Obituaries say a lot. They really do. They say an awful lot. And most of them are quite sad, because most of them follow the normal pattern. So-and-so was born on such and such a date, died on such and such a date, so-and-so graduated high school in such a year, so-and-so worked 30 years at such and such a place, and so-and-so enjoyed his family, whatever. And that's it. That's it. That's what their life is defined by. Read an obituary that says, and so walked with God. Now that's a good obituary. The overall course of Enoch's life is described in those words. Enoch walked with God. The word walk throughout Scripture is used to describe the habitual way of life. Not an occasional, but the habitual way of life. The overall course of one's life. Every life has a course. Every life has a way. And concerning such in our text, there is Enoch and there is God. There's Enoch, there's God. And so it is. There is us, and there is God. Us and God. That's true of every human being. There is us, there is God. Now, by way of personal examination, what does that look like in our life? Us, God. What does it look like in our life? Now notice, it's not only just Enoch and God. It is Enoch with God. Put aside the word walked for now. And it is Enoch with God. That is a preposition speaking of a position relating to God. So again, by way of personal examination, what is our position? Our overall life, what is our position in relation to God? Fathers, what is our position in relation to God? What is it? There is our humanity. There are the temporal affairs of life. There is culture. But the most important matter of all, what is our position in relation to God? There's Enoch, there's God. There's you, there's God. There's me, there's God. Our position in relation to God defines everything else. Defines everything else. In our text, it is again Enoch with God. So Enoch is together with God in life. Enoch, a husband, a father, a grandfather. Enoch, a man with infirmities and limitations and struggles. A man with temporal affairs and responsibilities. He's with God. He's in conjunction with God. And that is the way to fulfill everything else. In conjunction with God. Enoch with God. What is our position? It's Enoch and God on common ground. Enoch with God. Now life, of course, is mysterious. We know not what a day may bring forth, but be sure of this. There's no better way than with God. There's no better way to go through a day than with God. There's no better way to experience trials than with God. There's no better way to bear burdens than with God. With God. That's Enoch. He's with God. In spite of everything else. So you think of those words, with God. Think of those words in relation to our responsibilities, in relation to our thoughts, in relation to our decisions, in relation to our motives, our aims, and our goals. With God. With God. Makes a difference. Think of those words with God in relation to friends, in relation to family, in relation to careers. With God. It's either with God or apart from God. There's no middle ground. Think of those words with God in relation to circumstances and the seasons of life. We need fathers who walk with God. Now notice the activity of Enoch's life. We see Enoch with God. He's together with God. And Enoch did something in relation to God. What did he do? He walked with God. Enoch walked with God. He walked. That's activity. His life was not stagnant. Enoch walked with God. To walk is to move from one place to another. And Enoch did so with God. With God. To walk is to progress. It is to advance towards something. And Enoch progressed and advanced through life with God. So the activity of his life was moving in the same direction as God. He walked with God. That's two people moving in the same direction, walking at the same pace. Enoch walked with God. What that means is if God stopped, Enoch stopped. If God went 2 steps forward, Enoch went 2 steps forward. If God turned to the left, Enoch turned to the left. God turned to the right, Enoch turned to the right. Enoch walked with God. You get a fork in the road, one person goes this way, I'll say they're walking together. They're not. Enoch walked with God. That's an amazing statement. He's a husband, a father, and a grandfather, and he walked with God. And I believe as he did so, there was a growth in his knowledge of God. His fellowship with God got deeper and deeper. And life became more and more meaningful. And Enoch walked with God. Through the various seasons, through the various needs, through the difficulties, through the battles, through the struggles, through the sorrows and trials. Enoch was not exempt from any of these things. But in all those things, Enoch walked with God. There was a drawing near to God. I believe as Enoch walked with God, he drew from God. He fed upon God. He saw God. You can't walk with somebody and not see them. Not only that, he felt God. You walk with somebody, you feel their presence. Enoch walked with God. And as he did so, he experienced God in his life. There was companionship with God. There was an association with God. There was an identification with God. Thank God for fathers who walk with God. That's what we need. And Enoch walked with God. He lived life observing God. He lived life occupied with God. God was the subject. God was the theme. God was the substance. God was the highlight, the essence, and the priority of his life. God was an influential force in his life. He was a dominating factor of his life. Whatever we are, we're children of a parent. Many of our parents have passed. but we're children. We're husbands, fathers, wives, mothers. But whatever we are, we need to walk with God. And that needs to be our life. Believe it or not, my life calling, my supreme life calling, is not a son, it's not a husband, it's not a father, it's not a grandfather. That's not my supreme calling. The supreme calling is God. Everything else falls under that umbrella. But our supreme calling is to walk with God. Now notice the duration. Verse 22, we're told that he walked with God 300 years. You and I can't even imagine 300 years. He walked with God 300 years. In other words, he did not just do this for a little while and then back off. A lot of people do that. A lot of people live their lives doing that. I believe they're saved, many of them, and they'll walk with God for a day or two, then they'll take 9 months off, and then they might walk with God for another hour or two, and then off they go. There's no consistency. Their only consistency is inconsistency. And that's how they live their life. That's how they live their Christian life, so-called. But this was not occasional. This was not something that was erratic. This was not an isolated incident. Every one of us are saved can remember incidents where we definitely walked with God. But this is not an isolated incident. He walked with God for 300 years. 3,600 months. 15,600 weeks. 109,500 days. Enoch walked with God. That was the direction of his life. A lot can happen in 300 years. For 300 years, during that time, no doubt there was, sometimes the winds were blowing against him. Sometimes all was calm. But whether the winds were blowing against him or whether it was calm, Enoch walked with God. For 300 years, there were many changes in his family. His wife changed in that time. His children changed in that time. He changed in that time. His grandchildren changed in that time. There were a lot of changes. Life is filled with changes. Some good. Some not so much so. But it doesn't matter. Enoch walked with God. That's what we're to do. There were days and seasons of heartache and struggle. There were days and seasons of joy and abundant blessings. There were times of sadness. But Enoch walked with God. For 300 years, he had this testimony. Enoch walked with God. Consistently together with God. Side by side with God. No better way to live life than side by side with God. Too many are fleeing from God. Too many are hiding from God. Too many are trying to avoid God. And I'm talking about God's people. We need to live life side by side with God. Again, Enoch was a husband. He was a father. He was a grandfather. He was not perfect. He had plenty of flaws. But looking at his life, it could be said, Enoch walked with God. Our families do not need perfect fathers or perfect mothers. They do need a man who walks with God. They do need that. And their lives will be better. A man who walks with God. May we be able to look back upon our life and see that our footprints are in line with His. And you look at your life. And you look at your footprints. And you can see where your footprints are side by side with God. Life was good. And you can see also His footprints, and there you go. We all have those times. There you go. And which was better? It's always better to walk side by side with God. Don't let anybody or anything rob you of that. You walk with God no matter what anyone else does, no matter what anyone else says, regardless of all the changes, regardless of things that upset you, you walk with God. That's our calling. God help us to fulfill that calling. Brother Ben, if you'd come and